They said Kaido Tanaka owned the silence in every room he entered. He did not command it. He simply arrived, and the air, humbled, would still itself in his presence. Tonight, the silence in the city's most exclusive rooftop restaurant was a thick, reverent velvet, draped over patrons who understood that the man in the corner booth was more than a businessman. He was a myth breathing their oxygen, a king holding court in a kingdom of glass and starlight. His power was a storm kept behind the impeccable tailoring of his suit, a quiet violence promised in the cold clarity of his eyes. Lena Washington, navigating the tables with a tray of crystal glasses, felt that silence like a pressure against her skin. It was the 7th time he had dined here in as many months, and each visit was a performance of absolute control. Tonight, however, the performance was about to be disrupted. His guest, a bloated politician sweating through his silk shirt, had made the fatal error of believing Kaido's civility was kindness. He'd boasted too loudly, laughed with too much familiarity. Kaido's response was not a quiet threat but a sudden, theatrical shift in the room's energy. He lifted a single, manicured finger, and the soft jazz from the house trio faltered and died. Every eye turned to him. His gaze, however, swept past the terrified politician and landed, with unnerving precision, on Lena. "You," he said, his voice not loud but carrying across the hushed space with the resonance of a struck bell. "Waitress. Come here." Lena's training took over. She placed her tray on a nearby stand, smoothed her red vest, and approached his table with a placid expression she did not feel. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She stopped a respectful distance away. "Sir?" Kaido leaned back, a faint, cruel smile playing on his lips. He gestured to the now silent stage where the musicians stood frozen. "My associate here has been boring me with tales of a city's culture. I find myself in need of authentic entertainment." He looked her up and down, a slow, dismissive appraisal that was meant to unmake her. "I am told this city is a melting pot. That it holds surprising treasures." He paused, letting the humiliation settle. "Sing for me. Sing a traditional song from my homeland, and I will marry you." The offer was absurd, a poison dart wrapped in silk. It was designed to make her a fool, to demonstrate his power to conjure spectacle from the mundane, to ruin a person for sport. A nervous titter went through the room. The politician paled, finally understanding the depth of his misstep. All Lena had to do was refuse, apologize, and melt back into the shadows. But as she stood there, under the crushing weight of 200 expectant eyes, something else took over. Not training, but a defiant spark she thought had been extinguished long ago. She met his gaze, the predator's gaze, and for the first time that night, the silence in the room felt like it belonged to her. "Which one?" she asked, her voice perfectly clear, perfectly steady. The smirk on Kaido Tanaka's face vanished. The storm in his eyes stirred, no longer contained. He had thrown down a gauntlet, expecting a servant to cower. He had not expected a warrior to pick it up. He named a piece, a notoriously difficult and ancient folk ballad known for its complex melodic structure and profound sorrow, a song of exile and loss. It was a king's challenge, meant to be impossible. Lena simply nodded. She walked towards the small, empty stage, her footsteps echoing in the cathedral-like quiet. The spotlight, operated by a stunned technician, found her. She stood there, not as a waitress in a cheap uniform, but as if the stage had been waiting for her entire life. She closed her eyes, took a single breath, and the first note emerged from her lips. It was not the sound of a woman attempting a song. It was the sound of the song itself, reborn. The melody was a ghost, a thread of silver smoke winding through the silent restaurant. It spoke of cherry trees blooming on a distant mountain, of a lover's promise whispered by a cold sea, of a home that existed only in memory. Her voice, a rich and resonant contralto, carried the weight of a history she should not have known, an ancient grief she had no right to possess. She did not just replicate the notes, she inhabited them. The intricate vocal runs, The subtle shifts in pitch that conveyed oceans of meaning were executed with a precision that was both technically flawless and emotionally devastating. The language was foreign, but the feeling was universal. It was a lament that transcended words, a pure expression of sorrow and beauty that held the entire room captive. Kaido Tanaka sat motionless, the blood gone cold in his veins. The world he had built, a fortress of control and calculated cruelty, was being breached by a sound. He had meant to humiliate a waitress. Instead, a queen was holding court on his stage, armed with nothing but a forgotten melody. He watched her, the simple red and white uniform seeming to transform under the white light, the cheap fabric taking on the quality of royal vestments. Her hands were clasped loosely before her, but he saw the tension in her knuckles, the discipline of a seasoned performer. This was no amateur. This was a master. The final note hung in the air, shimmering with a fragile, heartbreaking intensity, before fading into the profound silence it had created. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if the song had permanently altered the atmosphere, leaving it sacred. Then a single person began to clap. It was Kaido. He rose slowly to his feet, his applause sharp and deliberate in the stillness. One by one, as if waking from a trance, the other patrons joined him, the sound swelling into a thunderous, standing ovation. Lena opened her eyes, blinking against the light, a flicker of vulnerability returning to her expression. The spell was broken. She was a waitress again, standing on a stage where she didn't belong. She gave a small, uncertain bow and quickly walked away, disappearing back into the shadows of the service corridors, leaving behind a room full of shattered expectations and a king who had just discovered a power greater than his own. He had made a promise, a public declaration. And Kaido Tanaka always kept his word. The back corridor was a world away from the starlit opulence of the dining room. Here, the air smelled of bleach and steam, a frantic, industrial reality behind the curtain of luxury. Lena leaned against the cool steel of a refrigerator unit, her breath coming in ragged bursts. The adrenaline that had carried her to the stage and through the song was now crashing, leaving a tremor in her hands. She had done it. She had met the tyrant's challenge and thrown it back in his face. But victory felt dangerously like exposure. A shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Kaido Tanaka standing at the end of the corridor, flanked by a man whose stillness was even more unnerving than his boss's. This was Kenji, the ever-present enforcer, a man spoken of in whispers. Kaido dismissed him with a subtle flick of his wrist. Kenji retreated, leaving them alone in the sterile passage. The marriage proposal was a jest, Kaido said, his voice a low murmur that seemed to absorb the humming of the machines around them. A tool to restore balance after my guest's discourtesy. He took a step closer, his expensive leather shoes silent on the tiled floor. Your performance, however, was not. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. That was a song few in my own country still know how to sing. It is a lament of the old court, taught only to a select few. Explain. Lena pushed herself off the refrigerator, her spine straightening. The fear was still there, but defiance was its master. I had a good teacher, a very good teacher, he corrected softly. His gaze was intense, analytical. One who taught you not just the notes, but the soul of the piece. One who taught you stage presence, breath control, and how to command a room. That is not the education of a waitress. He was peeling back the layers of her life with his words, and she felt a rising panic. The past was a place she had buried for a reason. My life before this is my own business, she stated, her voice colder than she intended. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Not anymore. You accepted my challenge in a room full of this city's most influential people. You made a spectacle of my power, first by obeying, then by excelling in a way that shifted the focus from me to you. In my world, such actions have consequences. They create debts. He reached into his jacket and produced a small, velvet box. He didn't open it. I do not offer marriage. I offer a contract. A different kind of alliance. He held the box out to her. Your talent is a weapon. I have enemies who appreciate the power of performance, of distraction, of beauty that conceals a blade. I want that weapon in my arsenal. Lena stared at the box, then back at his unreadable face. This was worse than a humiliating proposal. This was an invitation into a storm, into the quiet violence she had only ever witnessed from a safe distance. And if I refuse? Then the debt remains, he said simply. The threat was unspoken but absolute. She would be a loose thread, an anomaly he could not allow. He would snip it. Your performance tonight created a story. Work with me, and you will be the star. Refuse, and you will be the tragic ending. He was offering her a gilded cage, a prison of purpose. But her current life was its own kind of prison, a gray, featureless existence spent hiding from the ghost of a career she had once craved. Maybe a gilded cage was better than no cage at all. With a hand that was surprisingly steady, she reached out and took the box. The gala was a battlefield disguised as a party. Light from a dozen crystal chandeliers fractured against diamonds and champagne flutes, creating a dazzling, disorienting haze. It was a room of predators dressed in silk and smiles, and the most dangerous of them was currently making his way towards them. Marcus Thorne was everything Kaido was not. Loud where Kaido was silent, expansive where Kaido was contained. He was new money, a corporate raider who cloaked his brutal acquisitions in the language of progress, and he saw Kaido's traditional empire as a dinosaur ripe for extinction. He stopped before them, his smile wide and predatory. His eyes, however, lingered on Lena. She stood beside Kaido, not behind him, dressed in a gown of deep crimson that seemed to drink the light. On her hand, she wore the contents of the velvet box, a single, large black diamond set in a stark platinum band. It was not an engagement ring, it was a signet, a mark of allegiance. Tanaka, Thorne boomed, his voice oozing false cordiality. I see you've brought a songbird to the snake pit. A bold choice. Kaido's expression remained placid, but Lena felt the temperature around them drop by several degrees. Thorne, I'm surprised to see you. I thought you'd be too busy liquidating another piece of the city's history. Thorne's smile tightened. He turned his full attention to Lena. I heard about your little performance. Quite the parlor trick. Tell me, my dear, what other hidden talents does he pay for? The insult was crude, designed to strip her of her newfound status and cast her as a common consort. The old Lena would have flinched, would have looked to Kaido for defense. The woman standing here now was different. She had been forged in the fire of that single song, and she would not be so easily diminished. She met Thorne's condescending gaze with a cool, unwavering stare. Mr. Tanaka pays me for my memory, she said, her voice clear and carrying, drawing the attention of those nearby. I remember things. The notes of a forgotten song. The names of shell corporations. The quiet conversations powerful men have when they think no one of consequence is listening. She let the silence hang for a beat before delivering the final, precise strike. You should be more careful what you say around the help, Mr. Thorne. Some of us have perfect pitch. A collective intake of breath rippled through the onlookers. Thorne's face flushed a dark, ugly red. He had tried to humiliate her and had instead been surgically disarmed in public. He opened his mouth to retort, but Kaido stepped forward slightly, a subtle movement that was nonetheless a final, uncrossable line. I believe your host is waiting for you, Marcus, Kaido said, his tone one of utter dismissal. Thorne stared at them, his eyes promising retribution, before turning on his heel and stalking away. The crowd parted for him, then immediately closed back in, whispering excitedly. Kaido looked down at Lena, a flicker of something that might have been approval in his eyes. The songbird has claws, he murmured, his voice for her alone. I have to, she replied quietly, the adrenaline of the confrontation still singing in her veins. The snakes in this pit are bigger than I imagined. His hand came to rest on the small of her back, a gesture of possession and protection. Then we will teach them a new song. One of fear. The promise in his voice was as cold and beautiful as the diamond on her finger. The city air was thick and damp as they left the gala, the distant rumble of a coming storm mirroring the tension that lingered after the confrontation with Thorn. Kenji had the car waiting, a black sedan as silent and sleek as a panther. But they never reached it. They were halfway down the marble steps when the night exploded. The first shot was a sharp crack that shattered the ornate gas lamp beside them, showering the steps in a cascade of glittering glass. The second punched a hole through the car's windshield. Ambush! The well-dressed guests screamed, scattering like frightened birds. Kaido reacted instantly. He shoved Lena behind a thick stone balustrade, his body shielding hers as Kenji drew a weapon from his jacket with fluid, economical grace. "Two shooters, east rooftop," Kenji barked, his voice calm amidst the chaos. A third, ground level, by the fountain. Kaido pulled his own weapon, his movements precise and deadly. The man of myth and silence was gone, replaced by a warrior. He peered over the stone, fired twice, and the shooter by the fountain crumpled to the ground. Muzzle flashes answered from the rooftop. Chips of stone exploded near Lena's head, and she pressed herself flatter against the cold marble, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was real. The violence he had promised in his world was no longer an abstract concept. It was here, smelling of gunpowder and ozone. "We can't stay here," Kaido bit out, reloading with a speed that spoke of long practice. "They have us pinned." Lena's mind raced, her fear sharpening her senses rather than dulling them. Her gaze darted around their limited shelter, taking in the layout of the plaza. The fountain, the manicured hedges, the service alley she'd noticed on their way in. An idea, desperate and wild, sparked in her mind. "The music," she said, her voice tight. "What?" Kaido glanced at her, his focus still on the rooftops. "The gala. They play classical music out here on the plaza speakers for ambience," she explained, speaking quickly. "The control panel is in the security booth at the base of the steps. If we can get to it," Kaido understood immediately. A distraction. He looked at Kenji. "Cover us," Kenji nodded, laying down a hail of suppressive fire that forced the rooftop shooters to take cover. It was the opening they needed. "Go!" Kaido grabbed Lena's hand, his grip like steel, and pulled her from behind the balustrade. They sprinted across the exposed 10 yards to the small security booth, bullets whining past them. Kaido kicked the door in, and Lena scrambled for the sound system panel, her fingers flying across the controls. She didn't choose a subtle piece. She chose the loudest, most bombastic orchestral finale she could find, a chaotic symphony of brass and percussion. She cranked the volume to its absolute maximum. The plaza was suddenly flooded with a deafening wall of sound, a chaotic and disorienting roar of music that drowned out all other noise. The shooters, their coordination shattered by the sonic assault, hesitated. In that moment of confusion, Kaido and Kenji moved, firing with lethal accuracy at the muzzle flashes they could still see. 2 more bodies fell from the rooftop. "The alley," Lena yelled over the music. They burst from the booth and ran, the symphony providing a bizarre, epic soundtrack to their escape. They plunged into the darkness of the service alley just as the first police sirens began to wail in the distance. They had survived. They had won. But as they melted into the city's shadows, Lena knew this was only the beginning. Thorn had tried to kill them. Now, it was their turn to write the next movement of their violent symphony. The safe house was an exercise in brutalist minimalism, a concrete and steel fortress hidden in plain sight within a repurposed warehouse in the industrial district. Rain lashed against the reinforced windows, a frantic percussion that matched the ragged rhythm of Lena's breathing. The storm that had been threatening all night had finally broken. Inside, the only sounds were the hiss of antiseptic on cotton as Kenji tended to a graze on Kaido's arm and the clink of ice as Lena poured 2 glasses of whiskey. She handed one to Kaido, her hand brushing his. The contact was electric, a brief, shocking warmth in the cold aftermath of the attack. He took the glass, his eyes never leaving hers. "You were not afraid," he stated. "It wasn't a question." "I was terrified," she corrected, her voice low. "But I've learned that fear is just a signal. It tells you where the danger is. It doesn't tell you to run from it." She took a sip of her own whiskey, the burn a welcome anchor to the present moment. He watched her over the rim of his glass. That philosophy was not acquired waiting tables, the open loop, the question of her past, hung between them. She decided to give him a piece of it. My father was a diplomat. I grew up in places where the line between a garden party and a firefight was thin. It was a partial truth, but it was enough for now. It explained the calm, the resourcefulness. It did not explain the song. Kaido accepted it with a nod, filing it away. Thorn was sloppy, he said, changing the subject. An open attack like that is not his style. He prefers to kill with contracts and lawyers, not bullets. It felt desperate. Lena agreed, thinking back to the wildness of the shooting. He was angry. I made him look like a fool at the gala. You did, Kaido said, a hint of dry wit in his tone. But wounded pride doesn't explain this level of escalation. He had professionals waiting. They knew our route. They knew when we would be leaving. He fell silent, his gaze turning inward. The chessboard was being laid out in his mind, the pieces moved and analyzed. The leak isn't just in his camp, Kenji said quietly from the corner, stitching his own minor wound with practiced efficiency. It's in ours. The air in the room grew heavy with the implication. Betrayal. A snake not just in the pit, but in their own house. Kaido's expression hardened into granite. Thorn's operation relies on logistics. His illicit businesses are funneled through his legitimate shipping empire. He feels untouchable because his hands are clean. The dirt is all packed away in cargo containers. A plan was forming in his eyes, cold and precise. He used a blunt instrument to attack us. We will respond with a scalpel. We will find his filth, expose it, and we will find the name of the traitor who is feeding him information. We are not going to retaliate. We are going to dismantle. He looked at Lena, the strategist assessing his new piece on the board. Your memory, he said. You weren't just boasting, were you? Your perfect pitch extends to recall. I remember everything I hear, she confirmed. It was a gift, and often a curse. He nodded slowly. Thorn is about to learn, he murmured, a dangerous light kindling in his eyes, that a songbird can also be a spy. The port of Elysium was a city unto itself, a sprawling labyrinth of steel cranes, stacked containers, and the perpetual groan of machinery. Under the harsh glare of sodium lamps, it was a place of shadows and secrets, the perfect breeding ground for Marcus Thorn's criminal enterprise. Kaido's plan was audacious. Not a frontal assault, but a surgical infiltration of Thorn's central data hub, located within the port's main administrative building. Kenji had disabled the exterior security cameras and alarms, but the interior was a different beast, requiring a delicate touch. That was where Lena came in. Dressed in dark, functional clothing, she moved beside Kaido through the maze of containers, the salty air thick on her tongue. Her role was not to fight, but to listen. Weeks ago, Kaido had arranged for a bug to be planted in Thorn's office. For days, Lena had listened to hours of recordings, memorizing the cadence of security patrols, the specific electronic tones of keypad entries, the timing of digital server backups. Her memory was their key. They reached the base of the administrative building, a stark concrete block humming with power. 2 guards rotating patrol. 3-minute interval, Lena whispered, her eyes closed as she replayed the sounds in her head. The code for the service entrance changes daily. Yesterday's was a 7-digit sequence. Thorn read it aloud to his assistant. 4815162. Kaido relayed the information to Kenji, who was perched in a sniper's nest on a crane overlooking the facility. A moment later, Kenji's voice came through their earpieces. Guard 1 is at the east corner. Guard 2 is approaching the west. You have a 45-second window. Go. They moved as one, a silent shadow crossing the exposed ground. Kaido's fingers flew over the keypad, entering the code Lena had recited. A soft click and the door opened. Inside, the air was cold, sterile. They navigated the corridors based on the sonic map in Lena's mind. Server room is 2 floors up, she murmured. Pressure plate under the rug, 20 feet down this hall. Step on the left side only. They bypassed the trap, their movements synchronized and silent. The server room was protected by a voice-activated lock. Another piece of the puzzle Lena had solved. Thorne's password is a line from his favorite poet, she breathed. He quoted it during a call. The center cannot hold. Kaido spoke the phrase into the receiver, his voice a low imitation of Thorne's arrogant baritone. The heavy steel door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, rows of humming servers blinked with a constellation of green lights. This was the heart of the beast. Kaido plugged a decryption drive into the main terminal, data beginning to flow. As he worked, Lena scanned the digital directories flashing on screen. Names, shipping manifests, offshore accounts. It was all there. But one file name caught her eye. It wasn't a corporate entity. It was a name. Sato. Mr. Sato was Kaido's financial advisor, a quiet, unassuming man in his late 60s who had served the organization for decades. He was family. Kaido, she said, her voice tight with alarm. Look at this. She pointed to a series of encrypted payment logs, all originating from a holding company she knew belonged to Thorne, and all funneling into an account designated Sato. The payments were regular, substantial. It was the methodical accounting of a traitor. The drive in Kaido's hand beeped, the data transfer complete. But the victory felt hollow. He stared at the screen, his face an unreadable mask of stone, but Lena saw the flicker of betrayal in his eyes, a deep, personal wound that cut far deeper than any bullet. They had found Thorne's secrets, but in doing so, they had unearthed a serpent coiled at the very heart of Kaido's own empire. The meeting was held in the cavernous, wood-paneled study of Kaido's private estate, a room that had witnessed generations of oaths and betrayals. His 5 most trusted lieutenants were assembled, their faces etched with concern. Kenji stood by the door, a silent statue. Mr. Sato sat near the fireplace, looking as placid and scholarly as ever, a cup of tea steaming in his delicate hands. Lena stood slightly behind Kaido's chair, a silent observer, her presence a subtle disruption to the established order. Kaido began without preamble, his voice calm, controlled. The attack at the gala was a declaration of war by Marcus Thorne. Our infiltration of his port operations has yielded the proof we need to cripple his logistics. He projected the stolen data onto a large screen, but it was a curated selection. He showed shipping routes, illegal manifests, offshore accounts, enough to incriminate Thorne, but he held back the most damning piece of evidence. He was setting the trap. Thorne was able to anticipate our movements because he has a source inside this organization. Kaido continued, his gaze sweeping over each man. The room became deathly still. Our source at the port also provided us with Thorne's private communication logs. He has been using a dead-drop email account to speak with his informant. This was the lie. The bait. The account name is Icarus. We have the password. We have not yet opened it, he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. I am giving the man who calls himself Icarus one chance. Confess now, and your end will be swift. Remain silent, and I will open that account in front of everyone. You will be erased not just from this life, but from memory. A palpable tension filled the study. The men shifted, looking at each other with suspicion. Only Mr. Sato remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on his teacup. He took a slow, deliberate sip. A fascinating predicament, Kaido-sama, Sato said, his voice the dry rustle of old paper. But what if your source is compromised? What if this Icarus account is a fiction, planted by Thorne to sow discord among us? He is a cunning foe. He attacks with chaos as much as with force. It was a masterful deflection, a seed of doubt planted to protect himself. But it was also his fatal mistake. Lena watched him, remembering the audio files. Sato had a habit of verbal tic when he was under pressure. He would use a classical reference. He had done it twice during tense financial negotiations she'd reviewed. Icarus. The name Kaido had invented was from the same well of mythology. Sato had instinctively latched onto the bait, revealing his intellectual comfort zone, the same one he shared with Thorne. Kaido's eyes met Lena's for a split second. He had seen it too. An interesting theory, Sato-san, Kaido said smoothly. But unnecessary. He pressed a key on his laptop, and the screen changed. It no longer showed Thorne's data. It showed Sato's private bank records, the payments from Thorne's shell company highlighted in blood red. Because Icarus doesn't need a password. He is a ledger. The teacup slipped from Sato's fingers, shattering on the stone hearth. The quiet, unassuming old man was gone. In his place was a cornered viper. "You are a fool, Kaido," Sato hissed, his voice trembling with a sudden, venomous rage. "You cling to the old ways, to codes of honor that have no place in the modern world. Thorn understands that power is a currency, not a philosophy. He is the future." Before Kenji could move, Sato lunged, not at Kaido, but at a decorative sword mounted above the fireplace. He drew the blade with surprising speed. "I built your father's empire," he shrieked. "I will not see it crumble because of his sentimental son." He charged, the blade aimed at Kaido's heart. The final showdown was not in a boardroom or a back alley, but on a stage. Kaido owned an old, forgotten opera house in the heart of the city, a place of faded velvet and glittering ghosts. It was here he had arranged the final meeting with Marcus Thorn, using the traitorous Sato as bait. Sato, broken and desperate, had convinced Thorn that he could deliver Kaido, alone and vulnerable. Thorn, arrogant and eager for final victory, had agreed. He arrived with a dozen of his best men, striding onto the vast, dusty stage as if he already owned it. The only light was a single, stark ghost light standing center stage. "Tanaka." Thorn's voice echoed in the cavernous, empty hall. "Enough of the theatrics. Show yourself." From the shadows of the royal box high above, a single spotlight flared to life, illuminating Kaido, who sat calmly in a velvet chair. "Theatrics are the whole point, Marcus," Kaido called down, his voice amplified by the perfect acoustics. "You wanted a war, but you never understood the theater of it." On his signal, the house lights slammed on, revealing Kenji and 10 of Kaido's men, armed and positioned throughout the orchestra pit and the wings. Thorn's men were surrounded, caught on the open stage like unprepared actors. The firefight was brutal and brief. It was a symphony of destruction, the sharp report of gunfire echoing where soprano arias once soared. Kenji's men were disciplined, moving with tactical grace, while Thorn's forces, caught by surprise, were thrown into chaos. Lena was not in the box with Kaido. She was backstage, her role in this final act yet to be played. She listened to the sounds of the battle, her mind mapping the positions, the reloading pauses, the cries of the wounded. The main battle subsided. Thorn's men were down. Thorn himself stood alone, a wild look in his eyes, using a fallen piece of scenery as cover. It seemed to be over. The false victory. Then, from the rigging high above the stage, a figure emerged from the darkness. Mr. Sato, a harness strapped around his thin frame and a detonator in his hand. "It's not over," he screamed, his voice cracking with madness. The stage was rigged with explosives. It was his final, desperate gambit. If he couldn't have the Empire, he would burn it all to the ground, taking them with him. "Drop your weapons, all of you, or I send us all to hell." Kaido's men froze. Thorn stared up in disbelief, betrayed by his own traitor. This was the deeper threat. The chaos Sato had warned of, now made real by his own hand. But Sato had made one critical error. He had chosen a stage for his final stand, and he had forgotten about the queen who commanded it. From the opposite side of the stage, behind a massive velvet curtain, Lena emerged. She wasn't holding a gun. She was holding a microphone connected to the theater's godlike sound system. She took a breath and sang. It wasn't the lament this time. It was a single, pure, piercing note, amplified to an impossible degree. A sonic weapon. The frequency was high, agonizing, a blade of pure sound that lanced through the theater. Everyone clapped their hands to their ears, their teeth vibrating, their balance shattered. Sato, suspended in the air, was the most vulnerable. He cried out, disoriented, his hand spasming on the detonator. In that instant, Kenji, who had weathered the sound with stoic resolve, fired a single, perfect shot. The detonator flew from Sato's hand, clattering harmlessly to the stage floor. The note cut off. Silence rushed back in, deafening in its own way. Thorn, stunned and disarmed, simply stared as Kaido descended from the box and walked onto the stage, his face a mask of cold fury. The war was over. The theater was silent once more, the dust settling in the aftermath of the storm. Thorn and his empire were broken, his assets seized, his power dissolved. Sato's betrayal had been cauterized. Kaido stood alone at the center of the vast stage, the ghost light casting a long, lonely shadow behind him. The battlefield was now just a stage again, empty and waiting. Lena walked out from the wings, her footsteps soft on the wooden boards. She stopped before him, the silence between them filled with everything that had happened, the challenge, the alliance, the ambush, the victory. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask of a king was gone. She saw only the man, a man who had faced betrayal from his oldest friend and had been saved by the woman he'd tried to humiliate. "You gave me a contract," she said softly. "A place in your world." "I did," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. He reached into his jacket, but this time it was not a velvet box. It was a portfolio of documents, bound in rich leather. He held it out to her. "This is your reward. Your payment for the debt." She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. She opened it. Inside were the deeds and incorporation papers for a global music conglomerate, record labels, legendary venues, publishing rights. It was an empire in its own right, vast and influential. She looked up at him, stunned. This is too much, is it?" he asked, a genuine smile finally reaching his eyes. "You showed me that a song can be more powerful than a sword, that a single voice can end a war. I am merely giving a queen her kingdom." He had offered her a cage, and she had instead helped him conquer a city. Now he was offering her the world, not as a subordinate, but as an equal. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been reborn into a partnership. He stepped closer, taking her hand, the one that wore his black diamond ring. He lifted it to his lips, his gaze holding hers. "The marriage proposal was a jest," he murmured, his voice now laced with a warmth she had never heard before. "But if you were to sing for me again, just for me, my answer might be different." Lena smiled, a true, radiant smile that lit up the entire, empty theater. The spotlight had found her by chance in a restaurant, but here, on this stage, in this new life, she had finally found her own. She was no longer a waitress, no longer a ghost hiding from her past. She was a queen, standing beside her king, on a stage they had won together. And their performance, she knew, was only just beginning.